37. That is the number of Taliban commanders who ceased to operate within a single 72-hour period in the Sangin district of Helmand Province during the summer of 2010. Not captured, not arrested, not referred to a detention facility at Bagram or handed to the Afghan National Police for processing. Ceased to operate in the particular and irreversible manner that Special Operations Forces reserve for the most entrenched problems. 37. In 72 hours, by a force that CENTCOM had just ordered, removed from the valley. The order came down through official channels with the kind of bureaucratic confidence that only flourishes several thousand kilometers from the ground. It cited force protection concerns. It cited escalating contact rates. Now, it's cited, and here the institutional irony becomes almost geometrically perfect, the unsuitability of the unit for the complex environment. The unit in question had been operating in that complex environment for the better part of 3 months. They knew every compound wall, every canal crossing, every pressure plate burial point in a 4-kilometer radius. They had cultivated relationships that had taken years to even understand were possible. They had reduced the Taliban's operational tempo in their sector by an estimated 60% in a period when every other formation in Helmand was either holding ground or losing it incrementally. CENTCOM wanted them out. What happened next is not widely taught in staff colleges. It is not frequently cited in doctrinal reviews. It does not appear in the sanitized after-action summaries that flow upward through joint command structures like sediment through still water. But it is known. Among those who were there, among the intelligence analysts who tracked the subsequent contact rates, among the officers who watched the situation reports from Sangin degrade almost in real time after the withdrawal, it is known. This is the story of what happens when an institution mistakes unfamiliarity for incompetence, and when the soldiers paying the price for that mistake are already, by every measurable standard, the most effective force in the valley. To understand what happened in Helmand in 2010, you need to understand what Helmand was in 2010. Not the Helmand of think tank briefs or parliamentary debates, the Helmand of ground truth. The Helmand Province is approximately 58,584 square kilometers of some of the most contested agricultural and narcotics-producing terrain on the planet. At its peak during the surge years, it contained an estimated 13% of the world's total opium poppy cultivation. The Helmand River Valley, the green zone that runs like a vein of dense vegetation and compound-walled farmland through an otherwise featureless desert, was for the Taliban not merely a stronghold. It was a revenue stream, a recruitment pipeline, and a strategic corridor that connected the Pakistani border to the provincial capitals with an efficiency that NATO's road network struggled to match. By 2009, British forces in Helmand had been engaged in what can be described with considerable understatement as a grinding attritional struggle. The 16 Air Assault Brigade, the 3 Commando Brigade, successive rotations of 2 and 3 Para, the Royal Marines, all of them had cycled through a province that consumed resources, morale, and lives at a rate that made long-term campaign planning feel like an exercise in institutional optimism. The Sangin district alone had claimed more British military lives proportionally than almost any other single location in the conflict. A district of approximately 15,000 residents had required at various points the sustained attention of multiple battle groups, hundreds of millions of pounds in helicopter support, and a casualty rate that generated its own gravitational pull in the British press. Into this landscape, the British Army deployed the Royal Gurkha Rifles. The Royal Gurkha Rifles, 2 regular battalions, a regiment with a lineage stretching back to 1815, onto the Anglo-Nepalese War, to the moment when British officers encountered Nepalese hillmen fighting retreat after retreat with a ferocity that caused one commanding officer to note, in language that has been quoted so many times, it has lost none of its accuracy, that he had never seen a more gallant or more formidable enemy and did not wonder at their being called the bravest soldiers in the world. By 2010, those soldiers were British, or rather, and this distinction matters, they served in the British Army while remaining indelibly Gurkhas, recruited from the hill regions of Nepal, primarily from the Gurung, Magar, Rai, and Limbu communities of the mid-hills. Men who had grown up at altitude, in terrain where the nearest road was a 2-hour walk and where physical hardship was not a training exercise, but a baseline condition of existence. The selection process for the Brigade of Gurkhas accepts approximately 200 recruits per year from a pool that regularly exceeds 28,000 applicants. The ratio is roughly 140 applicants per available position. For context, the United States Army's 75th Ranger Regiment, an elite force in its own right, accepts somewhere between 50 and 60% of candidates who make it to selection. The Gurkhas accept less than 1% of applicants before training has even begun. What that selection produces, physically, psychologically, culturally, is a soldier of a particular type, not a superhuman, not a mythological figure from a recruiting poster, not something more precise and therefore more useful, a man who has spent his entire developmental life in conditions that NATO militaries spend considerable sums attempting to replicate in training environments, high altitude, complex terrain, physical loads that would be considered abusive in a Western gymnasium, and a cultural relationship with military service that is not chosen as an alternative to other options, but pursued with the intensity of a vocation. General Sir Peter de la Billière, who commanded British forces in the Gulf War and spent considerable time with Gurkha units throughout his career, wrote in his memoir, "The Gurkha soldier's willingness to endure hardship without complaint, combined with his aggression in close combat and his absolute reliability under sustained pressure, that make him the most consistently effective infantry soldier I have encountered in 40 years of service." De la Billière was not given to rhetorical excess. The 1st Battalion Royal Gurkha Rifles deployed to Helmand in 2010 as part of a wider British operational effort. They were assigned to the Sangin district. They arrived in a situation that had been described internally as kinetically saturated, meaning in plain language that the contact rate was high, the IED density was high, and the Taliban's command infrastructure in the area was deeply embedded in the local population in ways that conventional search and clear operations were systematically failing to disrupt. The Gurkhas did not approach this situation conventionally. What distinguished the Royal Gurkha Rifles in Sangin was not primarily their physical capability, though that capability was, by the accounts of every embedded journalist, intelligence analyst, and coalition officer who observed them, genuinely exceptional. What distinguished them was doctrinal, philosophical, a fundamentally different answer to the question of how a small force should operate in a complex human environment where the enemy is indistinguishable from the civilian population at a distance of 50 meters or less. The British Army, at its best, has always understood that counterinsurgency is not a kinetic problem with a kinetic solution. This understanding had been bought at considerable cost across decades of operations in Northern Ireland, Kenya, Malaya, Borneo, environments where the lesson had been learned, forgotten, and relearned with the reliable regularity of institutional amnesia. The Gurkhas carried that understanding, but they carried something else as well, a cultural proximity to the Afghan population that their American and British colleagues could not, with the best will in the world, replicate. This requires careful unpacking. Afghanistan is not Nepal, Helmand Province is not the Himalayan foothills. The languages, the religions, the tribal structures, all different. But the lived experience of highland subsistence agriculture, of multi-day foot travel through difficult terrain as a normal activity rather than an extraordinary one, of social structures built around extended family networks and reciprocal obligation rather than individual transactional relationships. These created a basis for human understanding that no cultural briefing package, however well produced, could substitute for. A Gurkha rifleman who had walked 4 hours to school in the hills above Pokhara as a child did not need to have the concept of a long patrol explained to him. A soldier from a community where hospitality to a stranger is a moral obligation, not a social nicety, understood something about how to enter a compound and leave it without having created an enemy. Major Adam Jowett, who commanded Easy Company of the 1st Battalion Royal Anglian Regiment in Sangin in 2006, and wrote with brutal honesty about the experience, noted in his account that the single most consistent failure of British operations in the district was the gap between the patrol base and the population. The compounds that the Taliban used most effectively were often the compounds that coalition forces had least access to, not because they were defended, but because they had been alienated by previous interactions. The Gurkhas closed that gap, not completely, not without cost, but measurably. By the end of their second month in Sangin, intelligence reporting from the district had begun to show patterns that were, from a counterinsurgency perspective, genuinely encouraging. Tip-off rates from local nationals had increased by an estimated 40% compared to the preceding rotation. IED finds through human intelligence rather than detonation had increased, and the Taliban's willingness to mass forces for coordinated attacks, the standard tactic in the district, a harassing rotation of ambushes designed to keep coalition forces reactive and patrol base bound, had begun to show signs of disruption. The disruption was not accidental. It was the product of a deliberate operational approach that prioritized time in the human environment over time in the protected environment. Where other units had calculated their patrol exposure in terms of acceptable risk, the Gurkhas had calculated it in terms of necessary contact with the population. Patrols that lasted 12 to 14 hours rather than the more comfortable 4 to 6. Patrols conducted on foot through terrain that made vehicle movement tactically pointless anyway, but which other units had avoided because foot movement increased exposure to IEDs and small arms contact. Here, the contrast engine runs at full force. A fully equipped British infantryman on a standard patrol in Helmand in 2010 carried between 45 and 55 kilograms of equipment, body armor rated for rifle rounds, helmet with ballistic protection, and personal weapon, ammunition load, communication equipment, water, rations, and the various attachments of a modern combat soldier. The Gurkhas carried the same, but where many units had responded to the weight and the heat and the contact rate by reducing patrol frequency and duration, the Gurkhas had responded by increasing it. Not from recklessness, from a calculated assessment that presence was itself a form of protection, that the Taliban's operational planning depended on predictability, and that unpredictability, in routes, in timings, in patrol depths, was cheaper than the alternative. In June 2010, a patrol from the 1st Battalion made contact with a Taliban cell that had been responsible for an estimated 11 IED strikes in the district over the preceding 6 weeks. The contact occurred at approximately 6:40 local time, in a compound system approximately 1.8 kilometers southeast of the patrol base at Sangin District Center. It lasted 14 minutes. When it was over, the cell had ceased to function. No coalition casualties. The subsequent intelligence exploitation of the compound produced communications equipment, weapons, and, critically, a series of contacts that allowed human intelligence operators to begin mapping a command network that reached beyond the immediate district boundary. CENTCOM, looking at the contact rate across Helmand as a whole, saw the number of engagements in the Gurkha sector and drew the conclusion available to anyone working from a spreadsheet at a distance of several thousand kilometers. High contact rate must mean the unit is having difficulty managing its environment. Get them out of the valley. Replace them with a unit better resourced for the task. The order was not malicious. It was not stupid. It was the predictable output of an institutional system that measures military effectiveness in terms it can count and struggles with terms it cannot. What it missed was the nature of what was happening in Sangin. The Gurkhas were not having difficulty managing their environment. They were generating contact because they were seeking it, deliberately, selectively, on the basis of intelligence that their own patrols had collected through methods that did not appear in the metrics being reviewed at CENTCOM. A unit that patrols aggressively into Taliban-controlled ground generates contact. A unit that stays in its patrol base generates almost none. The second unit does not appear on a spreadsheet to be having any problems at all. But Colonel retired Stuart Tootle, who commanded the 3rd Battalion Parachute Regiment in Helmand in 2006 and subsequently wrote one of the most unsparing accounts of the institutional failures of that campaign, observed in his memoir Danger Close that the fundamental problem of Helmand was a recurring mismatch between institutional expectations and operational reality. The people making decisions about what was working and what wasn't were often the furthest removed from the evidence that would have changed their minds. He was writing about 2006. The observation had not aged out by 2010. Now return to that number, 37, in 72 hours. In the days before the withdrawal order was to be implemented, the Gurkhas conducted what would later be described with considerable institutional discretion as a final clearance operation in their sector. The operation was not improvised. It was the product of 3 months of patient intelligence collection, of human source development, of pattern of life analysis, conducted by soldiers who had spent enough time in the environment to recognize the difference between a farmer checking his irrigation ditch and a Taliban facilitator checking a trigger point. The operation utilized small mobile patrols operating on multiple axes simultaneously, communicating through a command and control arrangement that required physical proximity, detailed prior briefing, and the kind of mutual understanding between soldiers that only extended shared service in the same environment produces. The 72-hour operation covered an area of approximately 12 square kilometers, an area that ISAF's broader operational planning would have allocated to a battle group of several hundred soldiers. The Gurkhas ran it with elements equivalent to 3 reinforced rifle sections, supported by a modest intelligence package and their own organic weapons. 37 Taliban commanders, not all killed, several captured and handed to Afghan authorities, several others displaced, pushed out of the district in a manner that degraded their network's ability to reconstitute. But the command layer, the mid-level Taliban leadership that had directed the IED campaign and managed the logistics of insurgent activity in the district, was functionally destroyed in a time frame that, when the subsequent intelligence picture was assembled, they prompted at least one senior British officer to describe it, in language carefully chosen for its understatement, as the most productive 72 hours in the district in 18 months of operations. The withdrawal happened. Orders are orders, and the institutional weight of CENTCOM's direction does not yield to operational counterargument at the battalion level, however well evidenced that argument might be. The 1st Battalion Royal Gurkha Rifles was pulled out of the Sangin district and repositioned. What followed has been discussed in various operational reviews, intelligence assessments, and informal conversations between officers of several coalition nations, with the careful circumspection of people who understand that identifying specific institutional failures by name carries professional consequences. The pattern, however, is not in serious dispute. Within 3 weeks of the Gurkha withdrawal from Sangin, the IED strike rate in the district increased significantly. Within 6 weeks, the pattern of life analysis that subsequent intelligence collection produced indicated that Taliban commanders, not the 37 who had been removed, but the second-tier leadership that had survived, and the outside commanders who had moved in to fill the vacuum, had reasserted a degree of operational control in areas that had been quiet for months. The tip-off rate from local nationals, which had taken 3 months of consistent presence and trust-building to develop, declined sharply. The Human Intelligence Network, which is not a database that persists independently of the soldiers who cultivated it, degraded when the soldiers who had cultivated it left. The American units that replaced the Gurkhas in Sangin did not fail. They were, by any conventional measure, exceptionally well-resourced. They brought heavier firepower, more robust vehicle platforms, more sophisticated electronic warfare capabilities, and more extensive close air support packages than the Gurkhas had operated with. What they could not bring, because it cannot be packaged and transported, was 3 months of accumulated environmental knowledge, established relationships, and the particular credibility that comes from being the soldiers who had demonstrably kept the Taliban away from a population that had very good reasons to remain skeptical of outside promises. The Marines of 3rd Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment, who took over responsibility for Sangin in September 2010, suffered casualties that brought the strategic cost of the district to levels that eventually prompted a re-evaluation at the highest command levels. 25 Marines died in Sangin in the following months. Scores more were wounded. The men were not failures. The institutional decision that placed them in a situation that had been actively degraded in the 3 weeks before their arrival bore some portion of the responsibility for what followed. Corporal Dan Bahadur Rai, a Royal Gurkha Rifles soldier who served in Helmand and subsequently gave a brief testimony collected by the Gurkha Welfare Trust, put it with a simplicity that no operational review has managed to improve upon. We knew every field. We knew which compounds would talk to us and which ones would not. We knew where they buried things. When we left, that knowledge went with us. It did not stay in the ground. It did not stay in the ground. There is a particular weight to that statement that rewards a moment of stillness. Military effectiveness is often discussed in terms of hardware, vehicle platforms, weapons systems, intelligence infrastructure, the price of a communications package, or a surveillance asset. The United States spent approximately $2.1 trillion over 20 years in Afghanistan, not billion, trillion. The surveillance architecture alone, the persistent ISR coverage of key districts, the satellite communications networks, the biometric databases, represented a financial investment that would be difficult to calculate without a dedicated team of accountants working from classified procurement records. The Royal Gurkha Rifles cost the British Army significantly less than the average American battle group to field and maintain. Their equipment was standard infantry issue. Their vehicles were Land Rovers and Jackals, not MRAPs. Their intelligence support was modest. Their close air support allocation was a fraction of what American units received as routine provision, and they had reduced Taliban operational capability in their sector by 60% in 3 months, built a human intelligence network that was generating actionable intelligence faster than it could be exploited, and conducted a 72-hour clearance operation that removed 37 commanders from the battlefield before they were ordered to leave. The contrast does not need commentary. It carries its own argument. The human cost does need acknowledgement, because this is not a story without loss. The 1st Battalion Royal Gurkha Rifles sustained casualties in Helmand. Good men. Men who had passed through a selection process representing a 140-to-1 attrition rate, who had completed training at the Infantry Training Center Catterick, who had deployed to one of the most dangerous districts in the most contested province of the most complex counterinsurgency campaign of the post-Cold War era. Men from villages in the Kaski and Taplajung and Dankuta districts of Nepal, who had come to serve in a British regiment and had done so with a standard of professionalism that made the institutional decision to remove them from the ground they had mastered feel, to those who watched it unfold like something beyond administrative error. The Gurkha casualties in Helmand are not widely publicized. This is partly a product of the regimental culture of discretion that the Brigade of Gurkhas has maintained since its formation, a culture that does not reach for press attention as a form of institutional validation. It is partly a product of the political complexity of commemorating soldiers who serve in the British Army while being citizens of Nepal. And it is partly a product of the simple fact that the losses of a regiment of several thousand soldiers, distributed across multiple deployments over multiple years, do not generate the concentrated media gravity of a single catastrophic event. They happened. They were real. They deserve to be named here not with statistics, though the statistics exist and are available, but with the plain acknowledgement that the soldiers who built that effectiveness in Sangin did so at a cost that is not captured in the contact rate spreadsheets that CENTCOM was reviewing when it issued its order. The CENTCOM order that pulled the Gurkhas out of the Sangin Valley has never been formally acknowledged as a strategic mistake. Institutions do not typically produce official documents acknowledging that their decisions were wrong when the evidence for that conclusion comes packaged with implications for the individuals who made them. What has emerged gradually through operational reviews, through the accounts of officers who were present, and through the broader retrospective literature on the Helmand campaign, is a consensus that is expressed in careful language but points in a single unmistakable direction. The British Army Review, in its 2012 analysis of small unit effectiveness in Helmand, noted units that maintained consistent presence in their operational areas over extended periods produced measurably superior intelligence outcomes and population engagement metrics compared to units rotated into unfamiliar environments with superior equipment but shorter familiarization time. The report did not name the Royal Gurkha Rifles. It did not need to. General David Richards, who served as Chief of the Defense Staff and had extensive personal experience of the Gurkha capability across multiple operational theaters, said in a 2014 interview with the Daily Telegraph, "The Gurkha is the finest infantry soldier in the world. I do not say that for effect or for tradition. I say it because every operational measure I have seen in 40 years of service supports that conclusion without qualification." Richards was not speaking specifically about Sangin. He was speaking about a pattern that Sangin exemplified. Return one final time to the number 37 in 72 hours by a force that had been ordered out of the valley. That number is not a boast. It is not a record to be celebrated with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a scoreboard. It is rather a measurement, a precise, documented, operationally verified measurement of what 3 months of patient presence, cultural competence, and aggressive but intelligent operational tempo can produce in a complex counterinsurgency environment. It is also a measurement of what was lost when the institutional system looked at that effectiveness and read it from a distance of several thousand kilometers as evidence of a problem requiring administrative correction. The lesson is not that small is always better. It is not that high-tech is always inferior. It is not that American forces were wrong and British forces were right, or that CENTCOM was incompetent and the Gurkhas were infallible. These are the simplifications available to people who need comfort more than they need understanding. The actual lesson is harder and more durable. Military effectiveness in a complex human environment is not a software package that can be installed in a new unit when the previous unit is rotated out. It is not a function of equipment or budget or the size of the force, or the sophistication of the surveillance architecture overhead. It is the accumulated product of physical presence, consistent human contact, cultural competence, aggressive intelligence collection, and the kind of institutional trust between soldiers and the population, between a unit and its operational environment that takes months to build and can be destroyed in 3 weeks. The Gurkha Welfare Trust, which has supported Gurkha veterans and their families for over 40 years, notes that the regiment's ethos is encapsulated in a single phrase, Kafar Hunu Banda Marnu Ramro. It is better to die than to be a coward. The phrase has been rendered in various translations over 2 centuries of British service and misrepresented more often than it has been understood. It is not an invitation to recklessness. It is a statement about the relationship between personal integrity and professional obligation, about the idea that the soldier who abandons his standard of conduct because the situation has become difficult has failed a test that no subsequent performance can redeem. The Gurkhas did not abandon their standard of conduct when CENTCOM ordered them out of the valley. They conducted a final clearance operation that removed 37 commanders from the battlefield, handed over what they could to the units following them, and left. The knowledge, as Corporal Rai observed, did not stay in the ground. The Taliban, to their credit as a military organization, if to nothing else, understood exactly what had been lost. Within 72 hours of the Gurkha departure, the first IED emplacement teams were back in areas that had been clear for 6 weeks. They had been waiting. They knew with the granular precision of people who had been watching from inside the population exactly when the force that had made their operations prohibitively costly had stopped watching back. The Americans who came after them were brave. They were well equipped. They were professionally trained. They were sent into a situation that had been actively degraded by an administrative decision made by people who could not see the situation from where they were sitting. 25 of them did not come home. You can spend $2.1 trillion on a war. You can field the most sophisticated surveillance architecture in the history of armed conflict. You can build forward operating bases with gymnasiums and fast food franchises and hospital facilities that would be competitive with regional trauma centers in the countries you left to build them. You can develop body armor rated to stop a 7.62 millimeter round at 30 meters, a helmet that costs more than a Nepalese family earns in 5 years, and a communications network that lets a commander in Tampa watch a patrol in Sangin in real time. And you can still lose the argument in the valley, because the argument in the valley is not won by the force with the most equipment, or the largest budget, or the most sophisticated sensors. It is won by the force that understands at the level of the individual soldier carrying a rifle through a field at 5:30 in the morning. What the people in the compound at the end of that field need in order to decide that the soldier is less dangerous to them than the man who was there before him. That understanding cannot be ordered into existence. It cannot be budgeted. It cannot be extracted from a procurement catalog or a joint intelligence assessment. It is built slowly and at real cost by soldiers who are willing to spend enough time in an environment to know it. Not as a grid reference on a map, but as a place where specific people live, where specific risks exist, where specific relationships have specific histories. 37. In 72 hours, before the order took effect. The Gurkhas have been fighting in the service of the British Crown since 1815. In that time, they have served in every major conflict the British Army has fought: the Indian Mutiny, both World Wars, the Falklands, the Gulf, Bosnia, Sierra Leone, Iraq, Afghanistan. 15 Victoria Crosses, the highest military decoration in the Commonwealth, awarded for conspicuous bravery in the presence of the enemy. 15. In 2 centuries of unbroken service, the order to get those Gurkhas out of the valley was rescinded eventually, and elements of the regiment returned to Helmand in subsequent rotations. By that point, the cost of rebuilding what had been dismantled in 3 weeks of administrative decision-making had been paid in the currency that military institutions always pay in the end, not in budget lines or procurement delays or career consequences for the officers who signed the original order. In the only currency that cannot be reimbursed, history does not remember the order, it remembers the 37 and the 25. And the space between those 2 numbers, which is not a gap in the record but a measurement, precise, documented, and permanent, of what institutions cost themselves when they confuse the map for the territory, the spreadsheet for the soldier, and the order for the outcome. The Valley remembers differently. The Valley always does.